Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is Rufus King, the final Federalist, as I like to call him. I do want to give a side note here. He was the last Federalist to run for President of the United States as a member of the Federalist Party, but John Marshall would be around well after Rufus King as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. However, Marshall was appointed 16 years before King ran for president. That's why I consider him the final Federalist, though it is obviously a bit subjective. But let's go back to the beginning. Rufus King grew up in Maine. His family suffered a little bit of an attack from neighbors because of his father's loyalty to the crown when King was still a very young man. His father ends up remaining a loyalist, but King and his brothers end up becoming important patriots, dividing the family, sadly. But King is still able to go to study law at Harvard, and he is studying to be a lawyer when at 22 years old, the Revolutionary War breaks out and King leaves his studies behind to join the fight. He is quickly appointed as an aide-de-camp to John Sullivan, though this doesn't last long because he's elected to the Massachusetts General Court, aka the State Assembly. He stays in this position throughout pretty much the entirety of the Revolutionary War itself, and just as the hostilities end, he is sent by Massachusetts to the Continental Congress. While he's at the Continental Congress, he's one of these groups of young men like the James Madisons and Alexander Hamiltons of the world that realize the Articles of Confederation are not doing so great and a constitution is needed. Rufus King ends up being sent as a delegate from Massachusetts to the Constitutional Convention, where despite being a very young man, he participates in the debates and actually is put on the Committee of Postponed Parts led by David Brearley, which resolved a bunch of issues from that summer of 1787 right at the end there. And then he is also a member of the Committee of Style, who actually came up with the language that we now see in the United States Constitution, though much of that responsibility fell to Gouverneur Morris, of course. Rufus King, in this position, signs the United States Constitution, then returns to Massachusetts to help get it ratified. He does get it ratified, despite the vote being pretty close, and then he tries to get appointed as a United States Senator. Fortunately, Massachusetts finds a few other people they'd prefer to be United States senators, so on the advice of his friend Alexander Hamilton, Rufus King moves to New York and is almost immediately chosen as an inaugural member of the United States Senate, representing his newly adopted state. Seems that he moved there just in time to meet the time qualifications. A Massachusetts tram plant was one of New York State's first two senators. Now, he serves for 7 years and ends up resigning when President Washington asked King to take over as Minister to Great Britain, one of the most important positions in the federal government. This young man has skyrocketed up the ranks very quickly based on his merit. So he does go to Great Britain, spends the next 7 years as Minister to Great Britain, through the John Adams presidency and even into the Thomas Jefferson presidency. Now, at this point, Rufus King is firmly established in the Federalist Party, but Thomas Jefferson, as president, keeps King in his position. Now, this says two things to me. First of all, it speaks to the respect that many people had of Rufus King, whether or not they agreed or disagreed with him politically. Certainly, respect in the job he was doing as Minister to Great Britain. But it also says to me that Thomas Jefferson was wise enough to realize, hey, the Federalists really like Great Britain, and Great Britain prefers the Federalist Party. It's probably good for me to leave this Federalist, who after years has established a relationship with King George III. It's probably better to leave him in the position. And it was not until 1803 when Rufus King decided to resign as minister for personal reasons and come back to the United States. Finally, he does. And he almost immediately runs against Thomas Jefferson. Not against Jefferson directly, actually. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was the Federalist candidate in both 1804 and 1808 for President of the United States. Rufus King, in both of those elections, ran as his vice presidential candidate. Now, these were pretty sweeping victories. 1804, Thomas Jefferson beat Pinckney and King in the what today is still the most sweeping landslide victory in American history. 1808, of course, they run against James Madison and George Clinton, again getting pretty handily beaten. That brings us to 1812. Now, the War of 1812 is just starting, and the Federalist Party has begun to decline to the point where the Federalist Party in New York State ends up choosing to support DeWitt Clinton, a Democratic Republican candidate for president, against James Madison, another Democratic Republican candidate for president. Yes, the two presidential candidates were both from the same party, but the people of New York, the Federalists in particular, saw DeWitt Clinton as more along the lines of their particular beliefs than than James Madison was. Now, Rufus King does not like this. He wants to keep the party alive despite its kind of obvious decline. And he goes around promoting the idea that we should nominate someone for president. Now, it is a bit suspicious that he had just been the vice presidential candidate 2 times in a row, so he was probably the best person to run for president. Unfortunately, the Federalist Party does not actually name a real candidate. However, 2% of the electoral votes that come in are for Rufus King as president. Despite not officially being on the ballot, despite the Federalist Party not even running a candidate, he still gets 2% of the vote. Now, that's not a sweeping, very impressive number, but it's impressive that he is still getting votes because he is at this point, leader of the filtering, withering Federalist Party. And that brings us to 1816, when James Monroe is running to replace James Madison. Madison is not running again. Monroe looks like he's probably going to win, but the Federalist Party wants one last shot, and they're listening to Rufus King this time. They are nominating a candidate for president one more time, and that presidential nominee is Rufus King. Rufus King is the last member of the Federalist Party to officially run for President of the United States of America. He is, of course, defeated by James Monroe. Unfortunately for King, the Federalist Party in 1814 had this thing called the Hartford Convention in Hartford, Connecticut, where they met to discuss amendments to the Constitution. They were very anti-War of 1812, and by the time they are done with their meeting and send their resolutions to Washington, D.C., it's about the same time the War of 1812. News is coming in that the war has ended, and news is coming in that Andrew Jackson just had a monster victory in the Battle of New Orleans. It is a slap in the face for the Federalists. So 2 years later, in 1816, despite the Federalist label essentially being equal to treason in the eyes of a majority of Americans, they run Rufus King. He does not win, but he does win 3 states. He actually brings in, I believe it was Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have it. I have it right here in front of me somewhere. But we're going to continue on. He wins only 3 states, one of them being his former home of Massachusetts. With his loss, so too is the Federalist Party lost. In fact, in the next election, James Monroe would run unopposed. So, suck on that for a few minutes. Now, Rufus King, he's not done, because James Monroe does appreciate a lot of what Rufus King has to offer. He, first of all, goes back to the United States Senate for several more years, again representing New York. But then he is sent over to Great Britain one more time for another 2 years to be minister to Great Britain. Unfortunately, at this point, it's been 40 years since he helped write the Constitution, and his health is starting to fail, so he does resign after a year and a half, comes back to the United States, and passes away shortly thereafter, as, again, I like to call him, the final Federalist. Rufus King is one of the most important members of the early Republic, the founding generation that helped build the United States from, let's try this Constitution, to, okay, we've won the War of 1812, we are a nation now. His role, despite being against a lot of the people in power throughout that time, is extraordinarily important. And the one thing I do want to add about Rufus King, we talk a lot about slavery here. Unfortunately, slavery was a truth at the time. Rufus King is one of the most prominent anti-slavery advocates in the American Revolution at large. He, for a long time, talks about gradual abolition. He tries to help get rid of it in New York. He promotes getting rid of it in Massachusetts. And then in 1819, when they're discussing the Missouri Compromise that would be finalized the later year, he actually gives a speech on the floor of the United States Senate, promoting the idea of putting an amendment into that bill to abolish slavery in Missouri. He thought it was the worst possible precedent. He thought that for not just economic reasons, but humanitarian reasons. This extension of slavery could only mean the reduction of liberty to everyone else. It would adversely affect the economy in the future, and it could only lead to war. I don't want to end a Rufus King video because he is such a monster character by which I mean a monstrously important character in the building of the American nation, that I really do want to give him credit when a lot of his contemporaries did not take the same stand. So that is Rufus King. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit like. If you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos 7 days a week about the American Revolution, a bunch of fun live ones throughout the week at night also. So, thank you for watching, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.